Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. In this episode, I'm talking to John Wood Jr. John is the founder and organizer for Braver Angels. He's a former nominee for Congress and the former vice chairman of the Republican Party of Los Angeles County. He's also a musical artist and speaker on many topics of race and politics. In this episode, we started with the conversation talking about the Braver Angels organization and, kind of his ideas for starting that organization and how they have a big emphasis on not only having dialogue with people from all different sides of the political spectrum, but trying to do it to really do democracy. So not just to have some nice conversations, but to try to make something of it and to see any practical application from it. We talk about his personal background as being biracial. John is half black, half white, and he talks very candidly and honestly about that and his experience growing up. We talk about how some biracial or multiracial folks view race a little differently than people that are not biracial. I also give a little bit, I have in previous podcasts, but I have a little bit more background about myself as well, as I'm multi-ethnic, and talk a little bit about that and where John and I have many points of convergence in our experiences being multi-ethnic. We have a brief part of the conversation talking about, seeing this idea of the individual versus the collective or the group identities that people associate with, and how we should start with the individual, and then how do we move outward from that. And so we talk about individual and group differences and some of the overlap and some of the ways where it's dissimilar. We then talk about how he understands conservatism. John identifies as a conservative. And so he gives kind of the, historical kind of notion of conservatism and, how it, does or doesn't align currently. And then he talks a little bit broader about how this works in a general sense, but then how it works for the African-American community and how he does identify as a Black conservative and what he means by that and how he understands that. And so we also do talk about some of the kind of Edmund Burke kind of historic conservatism and how it is not necessarily compatible with current modern day conservatism, and a whole host of other topics in this conversation. I really like John. I've followed his work for a while, and so I was really honored and privileged to have him get on the podcast and just have a very nice back and forth conversation. It's very friendly, and I would have him again anytime and to have him talk about any of these particular issues. So he's absolutely wonderful, and I highly recommend people checking out his organization, Braver Angels. They do fantastic work. So without further delay, I bring you John Wood Jr. I am here with John Wood Jr. John, it's a privilege, honor to have you on. How's it going?
Yeah, man. Well, no, it's a pleasure to be on here with you as well, and I'm doing good.
That's good to hear. So you have quite the mission and the energy of trying to have dialogue, which is something I'm doing. I think you're doing it at a much better pace than I am. I kind of sit with it conversation to conversation. You're doing it, kind of at a broad scale with your organization. So why don't you just tell us a little bit about your background, just generally, and then what you're doing now and what you're going to be doing in the future.
Yeah, sure thing. Yeah, so as you alluded to, I work with an organization. It's called Braver Angels. It's the largest grassroots bipartisan organization in America, working on the problem of political polarization, or working towards political depolarization. Though when I use the phrase depolarization, I mean something a little bit more than just getting people to have reasonable conversations with each other. It's really a mission to renew sort of the communal spirit of American democracy, if you will. and to increase our capacity to be able to communicate meaningfully across the divides, not so much to where we can just have, pleasant experiences with each other. Obviously, I would say that there is intrinsic value to be discovered in being able to humanize and engage across divisions, at least in terms of my own life. But in so doing, we create the capacity in society, or we seek to elevate the capacity of society to be able to collaborate in the direction of actually making meaningful material progress for society across the spectrum of concerns. Because regardless of what your issue may be, whether it's social justice, whether it's economics, or any sort of social issue at all, everything hinges upon the ability of our democratic system to cohere and to function, right? And that in and of itself hinges upon the people's ability to actually operate together in good faith. If we are in a position to where we are not so much neighbors, but enemies who happen to live next to each other, then there quickly becomes very little reason to have confidence in any of our institutions, because we can rest assured that anybody who's at the helm of our institutions is there to exercise power and dominance over everybody else without any conception at all of the common good. And so the idea of a common welfare is only operable in the context of some degree of social trust. So we're trying to create the context in which that can reemerge. As far as my own background is concerned, professionally, in terms of sort of, I guess, what ultimately led me here. In 2014, I was a nominee for Congress. I was a Republican nominee for Congress in California's 43rd district. I ran against Maxine Waters in that election cycle. I was a vice chairman of the Republican Party in Los Angeles County for about a couple of years or so. Prior to that, in high school, growing up, I very much thought of myself as sort of a liberal Democrat activist. I worked for Barack Obama's 2008 campaign. I, protested against the Iraq War. Prior to that, you can hear the family in the background here. I'm a family man, as you know. I guess sort of had a formative. Even going a little bit further back, I grew up in a biracial, multicultural family, a family that is sort of bipartisan. My mother is a liberal Democrat from inner city Los Angeles. My father is Republican. He's from Tennessee, and very much a supporter. Was at least a supporter of President Trump's, and I sort of grew up at the intersection of different ideologies, different generations, different races, different cultural sort of points of view on a great many things. And so I've always operated as something of a interpreter or a translator across different sorts of divides. And eventually that led me to the work that I do with Braver Angels, seeking to sort of rally the American people behind this way of doing politics, if you will. So that's probably enough to start.
Yeah, and just I guess future-wise, where do you see yourself or going with Braver Angels or otherwise? Where do you see next couple years, next 3, 4, 5 years in terms of expansion, or how do you see it kind of progressing along ideally?
So Braver Angels is a membership organization. Right now, we've got about 14,000 or so dues paid members across the country. We've got a couple of thousand volunteers. We've got about 60 or 70 or so local alliances, which you can think of as Braver Angels chapters. We one thing I didn't say too much about materially what we do, but we do a variety of things. Our on the ground work consists of workshops and community debates and town halls, forums for people to interact across divisions, to hear the internal dialogues of people on the other side of the political or even racial and other cultural divides. And people who participate in these experiences have the opportunity to go on and organize together. my intention is to see Braver Angels um, scale up in its reach and its impact, and to sort of emerge as a pivotal civil society institution in American life.
Mm.
I think we need that because so much of our current divisions and polarizations are structurally reinforced, I think, by the way the political media ecosystem operates, by the way social media operates,
Yeah.
by the way the political parties operate, and the perverse incentives that exist within so many of our institutions to sort of balkanize the American people in a way to where we pit ourselves against one another with warring sets of of, of facts, warring narratives, and even where good intentions may be present,
Hmm.
there's relatively little in America's institutional life that provides a bridge of communication and understanding and collaboration um, to allow people to sort of cross from these ecosystems one to the other uh, at anything resembling scale.
Mm.
And so, in the work that we're doing at Braver Angels, my hope is to be a part of building that, and building it also within the ecosystem of other groups and organizations and funders and journalists and leaders in other spaces who are also, I think, committed to building up an ecosystem that can allow us to actually build community together and reforge something of a shared architecture of epistemology and deeper values. Because
Hmm.
I think we're going to need that
Yeah.
if democracy is gonna endure.
Yeah. No, I fully agree. No, that's wonderful. Yeah, it sounds like I really enjoy it because it's conversation and dialogue with a particular purpose.
Mm,
Um, you're trying to foster, not that I don't think that everybody needs to be in the middle or in the center or just have some polite conversations, but that you can really have a good spirit of um, democracy, and that you can say, okay, you can have this idea, you can have this idea or these opinions, but how does that cohabitate in a way that is, it's okay to have difference of opinion, but that it also is not, um, I guess, so much in terms of where it's so far apart that people can't be able to see or hear and then work together for some of the challenges is what we still have by using certain institutions that
mm,
we have in this
right.
country. So that's really,
Yeah.
really wonderful. Okay, so tell me just briefly. I know you've talked about it on other podcasts and written about it, but just tell me. You alluded to it, your kind of personal background, and then we can set that up for one of the first points I want to get into. So you said your dad is from Tennessee and your mom is from LA. Is this correct?
That's
And
right.
you're from LA, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you, what term do you use? Mixed race, biracial, multi-ethnic? Which one
Uh,
is suits your
well,
fancy?
I, I guess they all point to the same thing. I say biracial. Some people don't like that.
Mhm,
Multicultural. I'll say that sometimes too. Sometimes I say multicultural to indicate the fact that not only am I biracial, but in my slightly extended family, I mean, I've got cousins who are Belizean and Brazilian and
mm,
Mexican, or some combination thereof.
mhm,
So I very much come from a broader kind of multicultural family.
mhm.
But yeah, biracial, whatever you want to say. Mhm.
Sure. Yeah.
Mhm.
I guess the point about that is that how do you feel that sort of kind of growing up that way?
Mhm.
I think we're roughly around the same age,
Mhm.
mid 30s.
Right.
But
I'm 34. Yeah.
yeah. So how do we? Um, how did that kind of inform how you were seeing kind of the world, or the lens, if at
Mhm.
all? How did you see that in terms of, you had talked about kind of holding these kind of two worlds, if you will,
Mhm.
in kind of your experience of how you operated, and saying,
Mhm.
okay, there's you know one side of my family, politically and maybe racially or ethnically, and then another side. And so as you, and how that was um, kind of integrated into how you are and how you identify, how did you kind of wrestle with that, or understand that, or come to some of the sort of the ideas where you've landed now based on your experience?
Mhm. Right. Yeah. Well, the political aspect of that wasn't actually quite as salient growing up. Growing up, both of my parents were actually Democrats. My dad didn't become a Republican until later in life, but what he was when he became a Republican, he was somebody who felt that the Democratic Party had left him behind
Mm,
for reasons I could I could get into. But he was always, in many respects, sort of the traditionalist in the family, in my family. He's older than my mother. He's born in 1950. My mother was born in 1963. My dad was very much a person prone to emphasizing the importance of traditional American values. Now, for him, he wasn't a religious conservative or anything like that either, but he had a sense of the greatness of American society as being reflected in its culture, reflected in its music, particularly the things that he grew up in, reflected in a storyline of social integration that brought people together through things that Americans shared, through sports, through boxing, baseball, jazz, all sorts of things that he considered to be distinctly American,
mm,
um, or vital to America. He was a person who sort of, I think, in a default way, raised me with the sense that America was for all sorts of reasons, sort of the greatest country in the world, or at least a place that we were very lucky to live in. And he had deep antipathy towards what he's felt to be sort of the decline of American culture in many respects, in ways that he felt sort of departed from, the greatness of American culture and popular culture in the 1950s and the 1960s, so on and so forth. My dad is a musician. I
mm.
come from a musical family on both sides, really. My mother danced on Soul Train back in the early 80s, late 70s. My father's a jazz pianist, played with some of the greats in West
Nice.
Coast jazz. His father was my grandfather owned the biggest independent record label in America in the late 50s and the early 60s.
Mm,
Uh, what what made my upbringing somewhat distinct was the fact that I was frequently bouncing between socioeconomic environments.
mm,
And I had three that were sort of native to me. On weekends, I would go and I'd visit my wife's family in inner city LA, and I'm hanging out with my uncle, with my grandfather, my mom's father, with cousins, and sort of sort of took in a certain aspect of experience that gave me a sense of you know a little bit about what inner city life is like. I mean, I was always a visitor in it, but I knew that there were neighborhoods that you didn't want to go into with the wrong color shoelaces on. When I was on the bus hanging out with my uncle and his friends, we always knew that there are certain places you didn't want to go, and if you did, you were taking something of a risk. Various things that I saw and sort of seeped into my kind of the color of my upbringing, if you will. No pun intended. On the other hand, over holidays, I'd go and visit my father's family, and my grandparents lived in La Jolla, which is a coastal community
mm.
in or around San Diego.
It's very nice. It's very
And
beautiful.
right, they lived in a home which had a multi-million-dollar view of the ocean,
Mm,
not too far. Not too far from the water. They lived probably just a couple of blocks down the street from Mitt Romney's house, the one with
mm,
the car elevator that they used to
mhm, mhm.
talk about in the 2012 election. And I'd spend holidays with my father's parents, and the Wood side of the family, in a fairly affluent context, a very WASP
Mhm,
sort of environment. But from day to day, I grew up in multicultural middle class California, where
mm,
we rented in a a house in a city that was, well, where that was very mixed. I mean, my classmates were Korean and Japanese and Jewish and Pakistani and Indian and Black and Latino. Culver City School District. At some point
Mhm.
I checked and it was listed as the fourth most diverse school district in America. And so
That sounds right.
gives you a little bit of a sense. And that was normal for me, sort of going back and forth in all of those ways. Growing up, I came to realize that that was fairly unusual, and it gave me a sense in terms of how race, but not just race, but race in combination with class, mixing with sort of geographic origin. I mean, I was raised with a bit of Southern nostalgia. I would hear my father would tell me stories about what life was like in Tennessee before they moved out to LA, and how he'd go back and visit his grandparents on the farm, and just sort of what life was like back there. He'd tell me stories about his own grandfather, who would tell him stories of pulled from the country. He was a school teacher in a very small town in Tennessee, and he'd tell my dad stories about Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone and Jim Bowie, and those stories were passed down to me,
Mhm, mhm,
um, alongside stories about Muhammad Ali and Jack Johnson and Sam Cooke and
mhm,
and the like. Um, all of that sort of went into creating the environment that produced me, you know,
yeah.
and it makes me, I think, a little bit sensitive to the implications of of identity across these different demographic categories. That causes me to tend to want to take these factors seriously in the context of understanding the nature of our socio-political divisions, and I bear them in mind as I pursue the project of fostering, space for people to communicate across those divisions.
Mm.
Mm.
Yeah, it's so interesting. It is very familiar in many ways with kind of also my upbringing as well.
Mm.
Um,
What is your background in that respect, if I can ask?
my yeah. My so I've said it a few times here on the podcast, but my dad is from he immigrated here illegally, but I think by those standards in the early '80s, and then probably
Mm,
by today's standards, he would be a refugee. But
mm,
nevertheless, he immigrated here. You know,
mm,
swam the Rio Grande and the whole story. He's been a citizen now of 35 plus years, but um, he met my mom, who was so he's obviously Latin from El Salvador, and then my mother is a white woman. She's from here in Maryland, and they met in high school, and they were married and had a good run for 20 plus years. And it was interesting because my mom was I don't want to say poor, but at least lower middle class,
mm,
at least, and maybe she would characterize as certain periods of her life as probably below the poverty line.
mm.
Um, and obviously, my dad was from a what do they call it now? I mean, third world country is how I was raised, but I think they call it something different now. Is it emerging economies or
Yeah,
developing country? Or I can't
yeah,
keep up with the terms, but
yeah, right.
it's poor, extreme poverty.
Mm,
Um, so there was this interesting dynamic, I think, between the two of them, where it was different, obviously, but they understood what it was like to have want of their basic needs, and again in different ways. But my dad came here because there was a horrible civil war in the '80s. It was a 12 or 14-year war in El Salvador, so civil war. So it's pretty ugly.
mm,
Um, anyways, so growing up, um, I was multi-ethnic, by probably more
mm,
accurate term,
mm,
uh, but we for most of my childhood, really until early to mid adolescence, we lived in. Um, I also was, or we were, I would say, lower middle class for sure. Um, and I grew up in and around, always in Maryland, but in and around Washington D.C. and some pretty tough neighborhoods for a while, just because of the economics. We just, my dad worked really hard, my mom worked hard, but it was really tough. And so as time went on, they worked the economic system in late '90s and early 2000s. It was not so bad economically, and then it was a little bit better, and so kind of lived in the suburbs for a little bit before I moved out on my own. And so, in a very similar way, my mom has these idea. Even if you ask her today, she'll say the country is like her. That's home for her. It could be the country of countryside of Virginia, or the countryside of Wyoming, or those are very different. But the country, as you would say, is kind of very familiar. And she lived part of her childhood in very rural kinds of areas of Virginia.
Right.
And so there's always this kind of interfacing between kind of my Latin roots and my dad's immigrant story, and all of those things. He sees himself as Latin but American, almost equally at this point. He's just very much integrated, and if you will, assimilated into that. And my mom is sort of the same in the sense of she has a very particular kind of traditional mindset. They both did. But she also had these kind of tough upbringings, and was able to make something of herself, and do well when they were together. And so I think growing up, I've had people ask me like, well, do you see yourself as more Latin or more white? And it's a strange thing, because I don't feel, I never really have. I always see myself as equally both. And there is this dance of sorts of kind of understanding, in a way, what culture means to different people, what race and ethnicity means. And it's like, okay, with white folk, there's certain normative things, generally speaking, and with Latin folk is some normative things. And so kind of, it's just both for me. And so, but I find that, again, no pun intended, but that colors my view of how I see race, and how I see ethnicity, and it is very challenging, because I think if I were to ask someone that is just, quote unquote, 100% African American or 100% white or whatever, generally speaking, it is very different. It's a different perspective on how they see both race and kind of society. And I'm curious if that's sort of kind of in your story a little bit similar, in how you're seeing the lens of race, if you will, somewhat differently because of your multicultural or biracial kinds of upbringing and identity, where it's like, well, it's not a this kind of polar, it's either or kind of thing. It's a kind of both and kind of thing. Or how do you now, when you see things in society and race relations in the United States, how do you kind of see it in that way?
Right. Well, I think that the reason I tend to want to couple the variable of race with other factors as well, including class, including geography, is because I think that ultimately it's not really a sort of a univariate determinant in
Hmm.
terms of race, or one's relative racial composition kind of defining one's racial perspective. I'll tell you a little bit of a story, and I definitely sympathize, from my own upbringing, with this wrestling with oneself in terms of trying to figure out, well, where am I on the spectrum of white and black? Am I more white? Am I more black? And should
Hmm.
I want to be one more or the other? And I ultimately sort of landed, I think, where you did, and just sort of feeling like, I'm me. I'm equally both of these things. When I was, but when I was about 5 years old or so, I've told this story in a few places, but um, I noticed that I had noticed that other kids tended to be the same color as their parents, you know. But in my household, there were three different colors. There was my dad, who was, white or more beige, or my mom, who was black or more sort of dark, darker shade of brown, and there's me and my brother, sort of, caramel in between.
Mm-hmm.
And so I asked my dad. I said, he was in the kitchen. He was making lunch or something, and I asked him. I came up to him. I said, "Dad," he said, "Yeah, yes, son." And I said, "You're white, right?" And he looked at me and he said, "Yes." And I said, "And mom's black, right?" And he sort of, you know, looked to the side and said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, what does that make me?" And he said, "Oh, can't you tell?" And I said, "No." And so he stopped what he was doing. He turned around to face me. He sort of bent down a little bit, and he took my hand, picked up my hand, and turned it around so I could see the back of my hand.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, "You're tan." And I said, "I'm tan?" And he said, "You're tan." And so from that point on, for the next couple of years anyway, my self-understood racial identification was tan, until somebody pointed out to me that that's not actually a thing. you know but it created this category for myself, within myself, in my early childhood. And at a certain point, I started to discover, the complications associated with race in a deeper way. I remember there was certainly a period in my life where I felt insecure about not being Black enough.
Mm.
Now, one thing I noticed fairly early on was that there were different kinds of Black kids, and it and that I seemed to be on one side of this, and most Black kids I knew, although not all, were on the other side of it. And it wasn't a mixed versus being full Black sort of thing primarily. It wasn't primarily a light skinned versus dark skinned sort of thing, although it mapped onto those divisions a little bit, somewhat. But I noticed that there's a difference between Black and also Latino kids, for that matter, but particularly there's a difference between Black kids who I went to school with, who were bussed in from the inner city, or bussed in from South Central LA.
Mm-hmm.
There was a difference between them and the suburban Black kids who lived in neighborhoods like I did.
Mm.
You know, um, there was also something of a difference, I guess, between myself and some of my relatives in my mom's family. Many of whom lived in LA. And I felt that the differences were that I felt that kids from kids were being bussed in. I felt like they tended to be more confident. I felt like they tended to be more assertive. I felt like they tended to be less afraid of authority. I felt like they tended to be, they tended to be the best basketball players. They tended to be, more athletic, more physical. They talked a different way. There was, there's a slang, and a lot of it, obviously you would detect it in hip hop and so forth. And there was kind of a vernacular that came naturally to them, which was in my family too. But my dad raised me very conscientiously to try and avoid some of that dialectically. My dad was very adamant about me speaking, quote, the King's English, right? I mean, that was the phrase that he used.
Mm-hmm.
And so, none of it was unfamiliar to me exactly, but there was, it was, and I've never read Thomas Chatterton Williams' book, Losing My Cool, but this is basically, I think, what he writes about.
Mm-hmm.
There was a version of Blackness that came through that experience that seemed to contrast with whatever type of Black person I was. And so, in an effort to be more Black, I, like many other Black kids who are like me, who are from, more kind of, integrated, I guess, environments, middle class, suburban environments, so on and so forth. I tried to imitate behavior, way of speaking, and so forth as a means of fitting in with Black kids. And there's this, I guess I'll lean into another story here. There's this guy who I went to middle school with, um, and his name was Tony, and he was he was like me. He was biracial, right? His mother was white and his dad was Black. Um, and he always kind of struck me as a model for myself. I wanted to be like this guy. I wanted to be like Tony, because Tony was like, he was a mixed guy who he was a great basketball player. He had, like, in a swag like Genuine or whatnot. He dressed really cool, and, like, white kids, Black kids, white girls, Black girls, everyone in between seemed to like him, and he was really sort of at ease and confident with himself, and nobody was questioning his Blackness, even though we were the same color, very similar texture hair, all that, right? I felt like, he embodied what I wanted to be. Like, he was the Charizard to my Charmander in Pokemon terms or something. And but I remember one day I was in class with him. Class had let out or something, or maybe it was right before class started. I forget. But it was just sort of him and I sitting next to each other. I didn't know him that well, so finding myself next to him, I sort of took advantage of the moment, and for whatever reason, I felt like it was, well, I guess for reasons that are understandable based off of what I've just said, I took the opportunity to kind of signal to him how proud I was of being Black. Like, and I can't remember what I might have said, but I really wanted to give kind of the raised fist sort of, like, vibe to him. And he nodded his head, I remember, and he said, yeah. He said, and then he said to me, he said, I'm proud of being Black too. He said, but don't forget, John. He said, you're half white also. And he said, and we're just as white as we are Black. Yeah, and you should be just as proud of that. And when he said that, it was kind of a shot to the gut for me a little bit, and I felt kind of a stab of shame on some level, because in my mind I had been trying to own one part of myself more than another, and in so doing, I felt like I was dishonoring dishonoring my father so as to lift up my mother, if you will, And from that point on, I kind of leaned away from that, and my desire was to just sort of to be me and to be embracing again of every aspect of who I was on the level of identity. But that doesn't mean that the journey hasn't, in some sense, continued, because now, as I've moved into adulthood, I've come to consider the implications of my, cultural identity and really just my experience, which is kind of a more meaningful word here. You know, I have opportunity to reflect on how it colors my perspective, how it impacts the way I see society, how society sees me, all that. But I think that it's possible to consider these factors without allowing oneself to necessarily feel wholly defined by them. I recognize that there's this history of the one drop rule in America. I recognize that there are certain significances to the color of our skin that correlate to culture, which correlates to politics, which is tied to history, which is going to have some impact on not just our present, but also our future. All of these are dynamics of reality that are real. And they even, have their interplay with who I am psychologically within myself, because inevitably culture and upbringing does, and all of these things are intertwined. But there's also transcendent sort of reality to what we are as human beings, beyond the labels and beyond the categories. And, that transcendent sort of reality, the fact that questions of character and virtue and righteousness are questions and aspects of the human condition and the human individual that are not determined by the color of one's skin, certainly, or even by society's evaluation of somebody on that basis. You know,
Mhm.
there's a higher frame of analysis of the human condition, wherein I think it's important for me to have my primary sort of anchoring. But beyond that, all these other things are important too. And so, uh, on the whole, I feel very blessed to have grown up the way I grew up and to have had those experiences and so forth. And I'm very happy to be me because it rounds out my perspective, I think, in a way that feels like it's useful in the America of today. And I try to put those lessons to good use.
Yeah, no, that's great. I resonate with a lot of that, and you you're bringing up uh, Thomas Chatterton Williams. I haven't read that book in a while. I just reread his most recent one recently, and he does this whole
You read a
thing.
book every 2 days,
Yeah,
I
I
have.
know. I'm always reading. I have a stack, and I'm always reading. Man,
It's
I'm
pretty
really
remarkable.
that's my favorite pastime.
Yeah, I can
People are
see
talking
that.
about shows, and I'm like, what shows? I can tell you the book I read. But
Yeah, dude.
um,
You make me feel not very well when I
no,
don't
I,
have it
I
too often.
I'm such a nerd. Sometimes my wife and daughter will be like, "What did you do when you were younger?" It's like the same thing I do now. I read. I go to the library, as many books as I could carry. I'm a nerd.
Right. Mm,
Um, and he does this whole thing of I like Thomas a lot. I don't know him personally.
mm,
But I love his writing. Like I like
yeah.
how his approach, his demeanor. Um, and he talks about this thing, which I think in two ways. One way I'm very sympathetic to, and another way I think he makes sense for him, and maybe for me, and maybe a few other people. But I think for most people, it doesn't. This whole leaving race behind. He's kind of done with race. He doesn't want to. He doesn't want to see or operate in that way,
Mm,
and I think that that's probably an ideal to shoot for most people. I feel like in society, most people aren't going to do that. Not quite yet, and not at a big scale. But I think that that's important um, to kind of push for at a certain layer. And I think you can tease out race from culture in some ways. Maybe people will disagree with that. Um, but the way I frame it is, and I think it's kind of what a little bit of what he's saying, a little bit of what you're saying is, I see it as you have kind of like at a core, right? You have the individual,
mhm.
right? Which is unique. That's unique with one's being. Yeah. So no one's going to be you, and no
Right.
one's going to be me in temperament and personality, all of
Mm,
our experiences, the total sum of our life. And even before that, just who we are at core.
mm,
So our individual personhood, if you will.
mhm,
And I think if you start with that and then you branch outward from the
mm,
individual,
mm,
then you get gender and let's see,
mm,
race and economics and class and education and all the particulars. And I
mm,
feel in society, it's the opposite. We start with
mm,
the particular variables, and then maybe at some point we get to some of the individual personhood. But I think a lot of the times, the outer layer of the onion or whichever analogy you want to use, people are focusing on one variable, and it's kind of like what you said earlier. It's a multivariate analysis that needs to be done in terms of a person. People are
mm,
complicated in many
right.
ways. And if I just funnel how I see a person through one variable out
Mm,
of a whole host of other variables, that is a way to do it. But you're starting with the most outer layer of someone that is going to tell you is going to be not, excuse me, as accurate about who they are, the uniqueness of who they are,
mm,
than getting at the individual of who they are. And so sometimes people will see this as me saying, you know, prioritizing individualism over collectivism, or that it's just this kind of pseudo conservative or kind of way of thinking about things. And I don't see it that way. I think what I'm saying is that you need both. For me, it's
mm,
just a starting point. You
mm,
start as best you can to see the thoughts and the feelings and the intuitions and kind of the sense data of a person, And then as you do that, you say, okay, well, how does their race or ethnicity impact? And then how does their gender impact that? And how does their upbringing and their experiences and their education and their SES? And then you kind of put that in the mix, and you get a more holistic view of it. And so, I think I think in part, when you have this idea of kind of race and how we understand it, I think that's kind of the rubric in which I use. I don't know what your thoughts are on some of that, but that's kind of a inwards as the starting point, and then we branch outwards
Mm,
instead of outwards on one variable when there's like 18 variables to try
mm.
and get at the person.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that that is the roadmap to more meaningfully and accurately engaging humanity. Um, and I think that it is a roadmap that can be most effectively applied in interactions where you have the space to get to know somebody a
Hmm.
bit better, right? It's harder to do that, of course, when we are just sort of passing by each other every day
Hmm.
or otherwise interacting with each other in more superficial manners. I mean, it's inevitable that we're going to generalize about each other.
Sure.
People don't like labels. Oftentimes, we balk at stereotypes, and yet, generalizations are what allow us to be able to be conversant with, these sort of broad categorical appearances
Hmm.
of of reality and social reality and human social behavior and so forth. I think, though, that that inevitability still needs to be tempered by an understanding of the fact that the general kind of, social prism through which we may find ourselves limited to uh, uh, operating within in terms of how we analyze and interact with the world day by day uh, is nevertheless is insufficient to really representing a true understanding of who and what people are. And
Hmm.
so the danger is not so much that we generalize in the way we talk about races or groups of people, not limited to, but including racial groups, but also, political, religious, um, ethnic, class, other cultural groups, and so forth. The problem isn't so much that we engage in the generalizations, but that we honestly do come to the point of sort of believing that the generalizations are actually accurate in a meaningful
Yeah.
way
Yeah.
about who
That's
and
right.
what people actually are, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
Um,
I would agree. I was just going to say that if you're relying on the heuristic, right? It's this mental shortcut of sorts of like, okay, well, I can't try and download everything about this person immediately. The
right.
problem is that you're reliant upon a person's A perception and B what their ideas are about that. So if you're taking one variable, race,
Mm,
what one person thinks or knows or understands about, let's say black folk or black history or black culture, then the perception is dependent on what they know or what they don't know. And if you're only relying upon that to understand somebody and you don't go past that, you're relying on an inaccurate heuristic. It's an
mm,
inaccurate shortcut because, for example, another way of saying this is if black folks are supposed to like hip hop and they like basketball, and you interact with someone that you meet that happens to be black, and they
mm.
don't like either one of those things, you're going to be very confused, right?
Also going to be a recipe for some
It's going to be
awkward
an
moments.
awkward conversation.
You know,
And
like, so how about that Drake, huh?
right. And they'll be
That
like,
beat.
I don't know what you're talking about. But listening to, let's
Mm,
say listen to electronic music and like tell you whatever,
mm,
DJ, whatever. It's I make the joke all the time that yes, it is true that in my household, there is never we are never out of black beans. That is a staple. We always have that in the
mm,
house. We're a Latin family in many ways. But that's not gonna happen. So if someone makes that comparison, you like beans and rice, you'd be like, yes, 100%.
mm,
But I also like many other things that aren't stereotypically Latin. Same thing for my wife, and same thing for my daughter. So it's just one of those things where it is too reliant on. It's okay in some ways, but I think it's if you depend too heavily on that, you're missing the person. And if you're trying to make a connection with people, you have to push past that.
Mhm.
And I think an over reliance or an over emphasis on race and how we understand them, I think in the long run just gets us more into trouble. But,
Mm. Right. Well, yeah, and it also prevents us from being able to pull some of the levers that might be available to us
mhm,
in, say, social and political advocacy and
mhm,
so forth. Because in engaging people on the basis of whatever we sort of consider to be the weaknesses or deficiencies or pathologies in their kind of group psychology, we prevent ourselves from appealing to the better aspects of of what is there to be conversed with, perhaps. So if we operate under the sort of sense that well, white people are so stuck in their privilege that they're numb to the sufferings of other people, they're uninterested, and therefore we have to bring a certain level of assertiveness to bear in advocacy. If you take that too far, you're going to wind up pushing people away who actually would be there to listen and would be there to constructively engage if they didn't feel like they were under attack by the mode of approach. I mean, similarly speaking, I mean, if you have a view of, I don't know, you have a view of African Americans that suggests that, well, they're so they're so blinded by their own cultural experience or whatnot that they don't have, any they don't care about the workings of our institutions and our traditions because they're all about Black power, being radical, so on and so forth. You miss the opportunity to actually engage people in a dialogue about how society and systems works, where you can learn something about their experience and why it is, certain folks' politics
mhm,
emerges and evolves the way that it does in the context of what they've interacted with in their experiences and whatnot. And these are the sorts of kind of generalizations that I come across, which I see feeding into the way we find ourselves content to engage each other or not engage each other, in the context of our larger political dialogues. Because once we have taken some sense of the sort of group pathology, I guess, that's kind of the way we seem to we seem to think about it. When we take the idea that there's these sorts of group psychologies that are deficient on board in our minds, then we come to the conclusion that vast swaths of humanity in this country are, if not irredeemable, then at the very least inaccessible to reason. You
mhm,
know,
mhm,
and if people are inaccessible to reason, well, there's not a lot of sense in me being empathetic towards them. Why not, therefore, instead just pursue a politics of power, where what I focus on is not building relationships, not building community, and figuring out how we can collaborate together for the common good, but rather let me figure out how myself and people like me, um, not even not necessarily just culturally, racially, but ideologically, can get into positions of power to where we can forcefully defend our interests, or use the vehicle of the state or other institutional power positions to defend our interests.
mhm,
And so that contents us to live in a posture of perpetual sort of cold war with each other. And the
mhm,
problem is that cold wars, generally speaking, they eventually become hot. You know,
mhm, mhm, right.
especially when the power equation is equal enough across the divides to necessitate it. I mean, something has to give, right?
Right.
So in the moment that we're in, I think what has to give is we either need to break in the direction of violence or of genuine nonviolence in the Kingian sense, right?
Mhm,
The
mhm,
idea of the beloved community. We're either going to break towards warfare, or we're going to break in the direction of cultivating serious serious empathy and serious understanding with each other, so that we can generate something of a renaissance in our communal culture and in our democratic society. So obviously, I'm hoping for the latter.
Yeah, no, that will, I think, that will kind of blend or two other issues I wanted to chat with you about. Well, while I have you, which is, so I definitely want to get to your piece, even if it's just briefly, but or as much as we can, about nonviolence that you had written, which was great, and which, is, I was rereading it before we came on, and it was cool, because apropos, because we're recording this on MLK
Right.
holiday, which is nice.
Mm.
But okay, so just to briefly, you identify as conservative, right? And tell us how, just very generally, how you understand that, and how, is there a distinction, or should there be a distinction of Black conservatives, and is that a worthy a distinction or not, or does it
Mm.
matter? Um, yeah, let's just chat about that, I guess, loosely, I guess.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, there's a lot of overlap in my sensibilities and opinions, and that of at least what on the sort of you know rhetorical level and surface level, or the sort of main tenets of American conservatism. I mean, I am somebody who considers himself to be a capitalist, or somebody who believes in market economics. I am a Christian, and somebody who believes very much in the broader anchoring value of religion in society. I'm a person who very much subscribes to the the idea that there's sort of almost sacred value in the values laid out in the Bill of Rights, the classical kind of liberal sort of orientation around freedom of speech. Um, and I'm a person who I think lives a life that is multifaceted, dynamic in a bunch of different ways, but then in many respects is conservative. I mean, we homeschool our kids. Prayer is very much a part of our life day to day. But there are two things for me to say, though, that broadly kind of distinguish me a little bit from conservatism, my conservatism, from that of the mainstream, if you will. First of all, my larger sort of conservative orientation is what you might think of as sort of Burkean.
Hmm.
Edmund Burke was a British or Scottish um, politician who is credited in many respects as sort of being the ancestor of conservatism.
Hmm.
Um, the classical conservatism that he and some others represented, and that Russell Kirk wrote about, and so forth, is really conservatism that was focused on the enduring value of institutions and traditions in terms of grounding our society in practices, in the cultivations of virtues and values, which allow us to build functioning societies and sustain them over time. Um, and the funny thing about it is that conservatism, understood in that way, doesn't even necessarily have an orthodox commitment to one precise institutional format or another. So when Russell Kirk was writing about conservatism and where you could find it in American history in sort of the classical philosophical sense, I mean, he jumped from John Adams to John Randolph, my namesake. So my middle name is Randolph. Some of the people who he mentions are Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton was a conservative in the estimation of Russell Kirk, not because Hamilton was like a free market economic thinker. I mean, in contrast to Thomas Jefferson and other folks, Hamilton was the person who really sort of forged the core argument for a strong central government in
Yes.
America.
He's probably my favorite founding father because of that reason. Is his strong centralized federal government. I
Right, exactly.
value that.
Right. I mean, there's much in Hamilton, which is probably more. You could draw sort of straighter lines from Hamilton to the way perhaps a number of progressives think in terms of philosophy of governance and so forth. Then you're going to draw from Jefferson to to many of those same folks. But Hamilton was a conservative because Hamilton was seeking to conserve something, and what he was seeking to conserve was the ability of the sort of unifying core of institutional and governing society to be able to maintain a degree of sovereignty that would allow it to bring order and stability to a complex society that needed to be operated with a degree of central oversight. He didn't want to lose that just because they were dispensing with the monarchy, right? And so, the way I tend to look at things is to say that it's very easy to see how society. It's very easy to see the flaws and the problems in society and its institutions because warts tend to announce themselves in glaring fashion, right?
Right.
You got something on your face and whatnot. But if you were to try and cut off your whole face, obviously you'd have a much bigger problem,
Yes.
than if you were to just try and isolate the blemish that needs to go. That's easy enough to understand when you look in the mirror, but when people look at the workings of society, a lot of times, I mean, the thing about radicalism, generically speaking, the danger of radicalism, generically speaking, is simply that it always risks throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, there are positive goods in society, I think, with respect to the value generative properties of the marketplace, with respect to principles and practices like freedom of speech and freedom of religion and various other things that we take for granted, that if we were to just sort of obliterate them more or less in the cause of equity or whatever the case may be, we'd be losing things that you really don't want to lose. Now, I'm not saying that most folks on the left necessarily want to go that far, but that's what I emphasize in my own conservatism. Now, in the context of Black conservatism specifically, I take a similar kind of tack in terms of believing that there is something of a cultural core to the Black community that has contributed so much of what is of value in the cultural history and the cultural resources of American society, that itself ought to be conserved as well. I enjoy being in the Black community. It is a different thing than being in a in a multicultural community such that I also loved growing up in and so forth. And it's different than being in a WASP sort of environment, which itself I think is probably pretty different from being in an Italian kind of enclave, or different from being in a Latino neighborhood, et cetera, et cetera. I should say Mexican, because that's the type of Latin culture that I was most familiar with growing up. There are things to be conserved there that are threatened with a degree of obliteration, I think, by trends in American life. Some of which proceed from good things that happened in society. I mean, I'm very much ultimately an integrationist because I'm a product of an integrated environment and it's something that I love. But, there was sort of a brain drain and a sort of a drain of resources and talent from the Black community, which came with integration. I don't like this sort of sense, this thing that's kind of, accepted in a lot of Black communities for reasons that are understandable, that success is measured by our ability to escape from the Black community. I was talking about escaping the hood and so forth. And the funny thing is that I live in South LA now. I lived in the Jordan Downs projects for about a year or so. That's where my wife and where her family come from and whatnot. And whether it's a Rust Belt town in Appalachian, Ohio, or the inner city community in LA or Chicago. It's a sad thing to see communities die, especially when cultural memory and traditions and other things might be dying with them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there are cultural goods to be preserved in the Black community, just as I also think that there's a sort of a frame for understanding American politics and American social reality that has to be traced through sort of the African American communal memory if you're going to have a firm grasp of it. And if people want to know more about this, they can see an essay I wrote for RL Magazine called "The Pivotal Irony of American Racism."
Mm-hmm.
The one thing I talk about in that piece, and I gave a lengthy sort of lecture on it on Benjamin Boyce's podcast. I don't know if you know Benjamin.
Yeah, yeah.
But is this fact that there really is a unique history of of structural and institutional inequity and oppression that obviously runs from slavery to Jim Crow, but that also continues in my mind after Jim Crow segregation
Mm-hmm.
across the 70s, 80s, and 90s in ways that most people are not fully cognizant of,
Mm-hmm.
And I, even in growing up, half Black and so forth, and having some experience in South LA and Inglewood and all of that, I had to really kind of live in the projects for a while to sort of start to wrap my head around, like, why is there the level of dissatisfaction with American life that there is in so much of the Black community post civil rights movement, post the elimination of Jim Crow and the passage of the Voting and Civil Rights Act and so forth. And part of what I found is that so much of the reality of the Black experience was, I think, defined by structural factors totally outside of the control of the Black community. The leaving of jobs overseas, the flight of manufacturing jobs, which made up much of the Black middle class, the sort of insourcing of competition in the agricultural and the service sector, which displays so much else of the Black middle class, and then the advent of drugs in the community, the advent of social welfare programs, which provided a subsistence level of income but no social mobility, and that
Mm-hmm.
sort of in turn wound up, it seems to me, financing much of that underground drug-based economy, which generated crime, which generated a massive police response, and this overarching epoch of mass incarceration that proceeded for the better part of 3 decades. There, when you're in the Black community, you find yourself, particularly in urban communities. This would be ironically a little bit less the case in Black rural communities. Actually, be a lot less the case in Black rural communities who would have more of a memory of Jim Crow and of that, the type of racism that is more explicitly racist and more, more clearly racist in my mind in terms of the intentions of the people involved. But even so, um, there's a different memory in urban Black communities of what American life was like, in the 70s, the 80s, under Reagan, so on and so forth, that tells a story that weaves together these events, even if people don't always have that analysis that I spelled out, which kind of shows that, for so many folks, this is reality. And from that comes a sort of cultural and a social disposition, which is fraught with a lot of pain, fraught with a lot of suffering, but also carries with it a lot of stories of overcoming as well that people don't get to hear as much. That I could roughly say is a Black thing. It's not that many other people don't have similar experiences, and many Latinos and Hispanic Americans were caught up in many of those same variables. Some white people were too, but there's a pattern, there's a sequence of circumstances that led to that led to sort of the formulation of some distinct cultural manifestations in the Black community, um, which I find myself having a relationship to, even if I wasn't, even if I also recognize that I'm not, exactly a product of that, you
Hmm.
know.
Hmm.
Um, and so um, I don't think that those problems and those memories are integrated in mass into a larger kind of, positively progressing social reality by seeking to just seeking to just sort of ignore them until we forget about them.
Hmm.
People carry their pain with them over time. They pass it down
Sure.
until it is positively transformed into something else. And so I have some sympathy with the anti-racist sort of contention that in order to name certain problems related to race, you have to name race.
Hmm.
I think that anti-racism can take that, in directions and to lengths that I would not, and or at least, there's all sorts of facets of the anti-racist analysis that I take issue with, but that at least I think is true.
Hmm.
Mhm.
So there's a few things there. So the first thing, back when you were talking about this kind of, Evan Burke kind of conservatism kind of thing. um, so I think that there's many things that it is rooted within the founding fathers, and I think most people, myself included, would be perfectly fine with that. I mean, that's a type
Mm.
of conservatism that is, I think, necessary and important and helpful. I think the difference there is that it does not appear, while there may be some roots with it, it does not appear to be the conservatism that is in the current political state,
Right.
at least in the United States. It's and I'm not only talking about the GOP, Republican Party, but probably primarily so. That does not seem to be the case.
Mm.
That it's that brand, at least in practice and in rhetoric and in policies, overwhelmingly so. They might all agree that maybe not all, but many of them agree that there's a spirit of that, and that's our tradition. But I
Mhm.
think in applied practice,
Right.
that doesn't happen. And so I guess how do you uh, how do you what's the word I'm looking for? Uh, make those fit, or how do you make them go together? They seem to
Mm.
be very different. How do you sort that in your mind? I guess.
Well, I mean, I think that the these things are very different.
Hmm.
Um, I think that you can argue. I'm tempted to write a piece along these lines, but
Mm.
I think that you can argue that Josh Hawley is the least conservative member of the United States Senate.
Yeah. Well, I think
According
there's
to
probably
sort of
conservatives
class.
that would agree with that.
Well, yeah, I mean, according to a classical sort of understanding of what conservatism is, because I mean, what Hawley sought to do seems to me is essentially sort of undermine our confidence in the functioning of America's core democratic institutions. It's fine assuming that he was honest, and maybe he was, maybe he wasn't, but
Hmm.
it's fine that he would want to bring accountability and transparency to the voting process, and he claimed to want to do so that people could have confidence um, in the elections,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
But one thing he failed, and Ted Cruz failed, and others failed to ever point out, uh, which any conservative who is sort of legitimately, or at least rooted in, the deeper kind of understanding of what conservatism is supposed to be about, ought to acknowledge, which is the fact that even when institutions are functioning properly, they can get things wrong, right? Let's say hypothetically, and I'm a person who, does not believe you know, for much of a second that Joe Biden didn't win the election. But let's just say that you had a series of extraordinary and subtle, manipulations whereby things were done that escaped the detection of many of the election authorities involved in overseeing the process. Maybe some people were corrupt, and that not only were these manipulations missed, but that efforts to bring them to the attention of the courts managed not to be done in a way that gainsaid the legal credibility of the judiciary system. In other words, they weren't able to make these arguments in a way that demonstrated, first of all, that they had standing, second of all, that they had a critical threshold of evidence in the cases where they were able to put arguments before the court. Third, they weren't able to gain any significant sort of traction in the legal establishment. And at every single level, media, legal, the law, the political class, generally speaking, the election officials themselves, there was a failure all the way up the chain in terms of our ability to detect this meaningful fraud that actually perpetrated the biggest crime against electoral integrity in American history. Even if that failure existed across the boards, the thing that we actually have to come to is an understanding of the fact that if systems and institutions fail, we need to turn to the task of working on their improvement so that they will be able to respond to similar problems in the future. But that what we don't do is undermine our fundamental confidence in the integrity of those institutions themselves. Because what that means is that, in other words, if you create a permission structure for people to feel that if the system, the institution doesn't produce the outcome that I think it should have, if I think that these institutions made a mistake, therefore let us turn over the institutions. And what you fail to realize is that the final function of any of the institutions of our governing system, even when it gets things wrong, is for it to at least stand as a structure that we are all bought into. Therefore, when it gets something wrong, we are all bought into the process of reforming it and improving it and working within it to make it function appropriately. What Hawley and Cruz seemed to do was invite people to take an attitude that said that it's okay for us to turn over the table because the legs were wobbly and a plate slipped off,
Mm-hmm.
And it's a bitter thing if you really do believe that the election was stolen to imagine that our institutions could have failed that completely. But what we lose in attacking, and people literally attacked, literally attacked sort of the core institution, the core symbol of American democracy in the Capitol. What we lose in that case, is something that is just almost impossible to rebuild starting from scratch. That's a radical thing to do. And, in the sort of conservatism that you see advocated that leads to that, we've got to understand that as a radical, conservatism, as a conservatism that's not particularly conservative, that's not truly conservative at all. That is the antithesis of itself on an elemental sort of level. And so, I think that's sort of what we saw.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that's the case. I think more and more as I've been watching things and I get older and I have more conversations, I realize that the crux of things are that I think on maybe your moderate blue dog kind of Democrats and with, I guess you could say, moderate conservatives or people that kind of have this spirit of, kind of the historic conservatism, is this understanding, and this is where I think it just kind of falls in line, kind of in the middle or in the center, is we have to have institutionalism. We have to have pragmatic institutionalism. It is impossible. I guess it's not impossible, but it's very unlikely that with all of the checks and balances that we have in our major democratic institution of voting, that it's going to be wrong all the way down. right? Even
Mm.
when you start talking about like it's the contents within the machines at the voting places, that's what went wrong, right?
Mm.
It's just how far are you going to go with that? And like it might be wrong here, 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 and here, but it cannot be wrong in all 18 parts, right? I mean, ostensibly it could, but I guess it would be very difficult, and we didn't see that. I think what we saw in 16 less so, but also this past election in 20 is, to me, when people start pushing that type of rhetoric, it just means that they don't trust people, right? They don't trust institutions, but they don't trust people, because what was the whole you know uh, lines on all the newspapers or whatever, digitally or whatever, that said in 2016, Hillary Clinton polled, 92% sure she was going to win.
Right.
Everyone was sure she was going to win, right?
Mm.
And I think that there was a distrust of understanding people and how people turn out and how they vote, and then how we have a whole process. And then this whole notion of Russia influence and all these things. Okay, fine. You want to investigate that, explore that. That's fine. But then continuing to push that for so long, it was a very much at least an ignorance and or an avoidance that people turned out to vote for somebody
Mm.
else, that they wanted somebody else. And that's
Mm.
what happened. That was our whole process. And I think it was sort of kind of, again, not exactly, but in a sense, flipped this year.
Mm.
How could everybody turn out to vote for Joe Biden?
Mm.
It's impossible. How did he win? How did everybody turn out in Georgia, to vote?
Mm.
And again, you have to just say, like, you don't trust that people turned out to vote that way.
Right.
And I don't think people are saying that, but so I think it's that distrust of our fellow countrymen and women,
Mm.
but it's also, and then yes, the institutions themselves. And this is where, for me, on both sides, it is going to be the death of us as a democratic country if we continue to do this stress test. It's fine to have a good, healthy criticism or making improvements, but to doing this stress test on our basic democratic institutions, we're just going to implode from the inside if we keep doing
Mm.
that, right?
Right.
There has to be reform, but there has to not, so kind of like you're saying, you don't just take out the whole legs, right? You can, tighten the screws and it's fine. Like it doesn't need to be, a whole, we just, tear it all down, incinerate it and that's it. Like
Mm.
that's not going to be helpful. So,
Right. Well, yeah, and but to the point about legs, I mean, just to bring us full circle,
mhm,
you're right. People distrust institutions, but they distrust each other. And
mhm,
really, social trust has to be the foundation of institutional trust and just the functioning of the republic, the functioning of our democratic system,
mhm,
broadly speaking, right?
yeah,
Of our democratic society. And so, I mean, you made the point that in both 2016, 2020, you had this sort of, on the part of many people, this, I guess, rejection of the idea that so many Americans could have possibly voted for for the candidate that
mhm,
won, at
mhm,
least won the electoral college.
right,
And but it's easier to come to that point of disbelief when you are that disconnected
mhm,
from
mhm. I fully agree.
everybody from from that whole half of America
Yeah,
that leans that way.
yes, mhm,
I forget who said it, but I remember somebody talking about a writer at uh, one of the big newspapers who made a statement along the lines of, "I don't believe Trump won. Nobody I knew voted for him." You know, it's like
This is myopic, parochial vision of the world. It's like,
well,
well, you
yeah,
probably need to get out a little more then.
well, exactly. But obviously, you've got people on both sides of that
Yeah.
tunnel vision.
Mhm.
Um, and so, yeah, man, if we can reconvene at the fundamental layer of our basic, goodwill for one another, and rebuild sort of a collaborative culture on firming up the edifice of democracy and community in this country from that starting point. I mean, I think that's where durable progress on the societal level has to be rooted, and what it has to be built from if we're going to transcend the perils of the moment.
Yeah.
In terms of the damage and destruction that can come from our divides.
Yeah, I fully agree with you, and I think that there's no better endpoint than on that note. I would I could keep going for hours, but I want to be respectful of your time. I will still put the article. We touched around some of the issues. I know in the piece that you wrote, about nonviolence of Dr. King, and then kind of contrasting that with kind of Kendi's anti-racist model. We didn't quite get into the weeds of that, but there's always another conversation we had on
there's
that.
There's always next time.
There's always next time on that. So
that subject will be fresh for a while.
Yeah, that's going to definitely be giving more. So just before I let you go, tell people where they can find you online or anywhere else. Where should they look for you?
Yeah, indeed. Well, Twitter is my primary social media home, so you can find me on there at John R. Wood Jr., Jr. And but check out Braver Angels, braverangels.org. If you're interested in our work, join us as a member. You can subscribe to the Braver Angels podcast. I appreciate folks for listening. And Brother Xavier, I appreciate you for having me on, man.
Yeah, man. No, it was wonderful. I appreciate you taking your time.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, man. Till next time.
All right.